In environments which are less regulated or not regulated at all, what are the key measures from a leadership perspective that could be taken to influence more of the thrive approach?
Let's if you allow me, I'll like to answer this question. Faisal, first referring back to your question where you say the regulations, the regulatory market or the regulations in this industry, how much are they influencing or guiding the action within the industry? From my perspective, I think, the regulators and the policymakers have waited for a long period of time for organizations to take action on their own. And take initiative on their own to take some action to reduce their emissions, to limit their impact on the climate. But the recent statistics tells us that we can't leave it anymore on the voluntary basis on the organization where they take the action on their own. And that's why I think this market is going to be led by the regulations. And this is what is happening. In the recent times, I can just refer to the UK changes into the regulatory framework which have happened. You could see that UK has put out a target for 2035 and 2050 around the greenhouse gas emissions. Alongside, they have asked their own listed companies to have a documented net zero plans published by 2022. Now, this is where you can see the pressure is coming from the governments, and it is asking the organization to start acting. I know at the moment it's only about putting the documents outside, putting just the pressure on the policy making, but this pressure, this regulatory framework is going to guide action furthermore. So that's the first answer I would like to give in that to your question, that this whole market, this whole action is going to be led by the regulations in the future, because it's already too late. A recent report from IPCC in 2022, it says that even with the net zero emissions by 2050, we will not be able to limit the climate impact and the disasters we are going to face from it. So it's already too late to just assume that by 2050, if we reach net zero, we will limit the climate impact or the disasters. It's not possible.
Exactly. I think just pause you. Yes, go ahead, Lester. Go ahead.
No, sorry, Faisal. I just wanted to endorse what Syed has said. I agree with Syed. I mean, I think if you look at human nature, by our very essence, we can get into inertia very quickly. We're full of good intentions, but we don't quite do it. Something else always happens. So I think we do need the push of a regulatory framework, and hopefully, when that happens, then we won't need that, because it will develop new habits and new practices. So we won't need that anymore. But I think initially we probably do need that push.
So we talked about the regulatory aspect and also a leadership opinion that it's we should be focusing more on the thrive approach rather than the comply approach. I'd like to ask Syed. We now understand what climate change is. What are some of the grave risks or the massive risks we are facing until, let's say, the midterm, short to midterm, and then from mid to long term?
Faisal, very good question, and this is what I'd like to speak my heart out. What I see is there is a lot of understanding around the issue at the regulatory and the policymakers level. They are trying to make the organizations and the leadership within the organizations to understand and realize how important and how critical this issue is, but it's not happening. It's not happening. Organizations are trying to catch up with whatever the pressure and the guidelines are coming from the top level, and I could see that there is an issue of sense making within the leadership. The way organizations are making sense of this whole climate action and the climate change agenda. Because you are also from the finance background, Faisal, and you could understand that. That's from my experience. I have seen that within the organization, when I work with these leaders and the people working at the top positions, they try to make sense of this whole climate action in perspective of return on investment. So there is a lens of commercialization for each action they take. But I think the challenge would be, this agenda is not to be looked upon from a commercial perspective. This is a very serious situation where we will have to trade off sooner rewards for some longer but later rewards. And for that one, we would have to compromise that, at some point we have to give up our sooner, smaller rewards in terms of commercial viability. And we will have to invest in this, take more climate action into the organization, and wait for later rewards, but those are going to be the bigger rewards, which in short, if I put in a word, it would be the survival of our planet, the survival of the whole humanity on this planet. And I think that's one of the biggest challenge, to make sense of it.
So if I were to ask you to paint a picture of 2050, if we were to continue without any efforts to improve the climate change situation, how worse it can get? Or what are we leaving our generations with if we don't do anything?
Sure. So Faisal, what's happening is there is this target of cutting the emissions by half by 2030 and by reaching net zero by 2050. What we are aiming is to limit the temperature rise of this planet, which is at the moment happening at very fast pace. But if we keep up with this pace of reaching cutting the emissions by half by 2030 and full by 2050, we will limit this temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. It's a bit of a technical language around, but you might come across this, that we have to limit the temperature rise of 1.5 degrees C. But as I referred back previously, the IPCC report in 2022, the sixth version of it, it clearly says that even with that limiting temperature of the planet, we are going to face some serious climate consequences. A lot of droughts we are expecting, a lot of wildfires, a lot of melting glaciers we are going to face in near future. And that's why this report, IPCC report, calls for not only for governments to facilitate the net zero transition, but at the same time be ready to face the challenges which are coming from the climate change. And especially they have called upon to help the underdeveloped nations, because they are going to be hit very hard. And almost, I believe there is a number in 2 billion people which are going to be directly hit by the climate change which are going to happen. And just let me remind you, this is all happening alongside if we keep up with the pace of net zero by 2050. Just think of if we don't meet that target by 2050, what's going to happen. So that's how serious this challenge is.
Faisal, if I can just add to one thing that Syed said, I suppose going back to leadership, this is about leading change in our organizations. And one thing we know, we often talk about, for people to change their beliefs, their attitudes, we need a burning platform. And I think this evoking what it could look like in 2050 without the necessary action is a burning platform, if ever there was one. And I think then it's how about our leaders in organizations put those messages across, frame those messages to get the right responses that we need. But I think it's a good example of a burning platform.
Lastly, finally, Lester, I request you to just discuss a little bit more about one of the very good aspects that you just touched upon, was the culture and the culture change, and to drive that culture change. Can you explain a little bit more about how we can use the cultural effect to counter a more responsive behavior towards climate change?
Well, I think, look, I mean, we often say that culture starts at the top of an organization, the tone of the organization, the culture is set at the very top. So I think it is one where we start with the board, the top teams who do. I think the answer, the question would be, in order to deliver on the sustainable goals that we need, what kind of organizational culture do we have to shape? What do we need? What would be the vision of that culture? What would be the elements? What would be the ways of working, the values, the practices? And I think we would define that actually and share that in the organization. And then, that would be an enabler and an underpinner of how we deliver on our promises.
Well, thank you very much. Indeed, Lester and Syed, I leave my viewers with the thought of climate change and the grave risks associated along with that, which entails responsibility on not only organizations collectively, but also on us as individuals. Let's meet in another reactice video. Till then, take care.
Bye.